What is the weirdest thing you've ever had to Google while writing a book?
This isn't weird, but the most recent thing I had to Google because yesterday I just sat in a coffee shop and like spent hours researching. And I think in my life, I never expected to research, the line of royalty in like Gaelic Ireland in 500 AD. Like, I never
That's
saw
very
that for
specific.
myself. It's very specific. And there were a lot of names that I could never, ever pronounce.
Mhm.
But it was interesting. It was interesting. And it is funny how the writing world, you find so many different people that I even on Instagram connected with someone who didn't think that was weird at all, and they actually are fluent in Gaelic Scottish. So
Wow.
like
Wow, what a
something
way to
that to
start a
me,
friendship. Yeah.
yeah, right, like something that to me is like incredibly random, and I would have
Mhm.
never expected to Google. It's actually someone's forte, you know. So it's weird how the writing world is so big, and you can find
Mhm.
so many things in it.
That's awesome. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Legend Makers. Today we're joined by Stephanie Petters. Welcome, Stephanie. So fun to have you on the show.
I'm so excited to be here.
So you were wonderful, and you had me on yours back when it was a project called To Eden, and then it grew up, and it's now called Of Wood and Word, where readers can find the intersection between faith and poetry. So we're going to talk about her newest project, To Eden. And she's using this as a way to network with other faith and fiction lovers through it. So uh, I think this is going to be fun. For those who don't know about this show, Legend Makers is all about interviews with authors and writers brought to you by LegendFiction, the creative community for Catholic and Orthodox fiction writers. I'm the founder and your host, Dominic. We're talking creedcraft and co creation, often rooted in grit, grace, gods, and dragons. We're all about inspiring your faith and your fiction. So let's start with point number one. I'm going to call this the Owl's Letter. What was the moment when you knew you wanted to be a writer?
It's really funny because I feel like when we have a passion and we often think of it as a calling, but it's also a choice. And I really feel that in the way I decided to become a writer. When I was in the fifth grade, every elementary student has this crisis where they're like, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I need to figure it out. And so
Right.
I was like, maybe I want to be a fashion designer. Maybe I want to be an architect. But I kept drawing boxes on paper, and I was like, that's not going to work. And I overheard one day a classmate saying that she wanted to be an author. And I was like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. So I went home that day and I just sat at my family's computer and I just started thinking up stories and then writing them down. And eventually that turned into like a whole binder of stories that I would bring to class.
Mm-hmm.
And people enjoyed reading them. And through writing those stories and making that binder, it was my first collection of short stories.
Nice. Nice.
I was like, I actually like this and I want to practice and I want to pursue it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I made writing like a daily choice. And just the more I did it, the more I got really into it. And so
Mm-hmm.
it eventually in high school, I got into poetry, and then that's where it really flourished. And now I'm kind of going back into the fiction world. But
Nice.
with the help of teachers and friends, they just helped me fine tune the craft, and now it's a passion.
Fantastic. Well, do you remember the first story you ever wrote?
I do. It's so I called it my week in preschool. And it was about, I think it was about a fifth grader or, someone in middle school who was so bad in class and like just didn't care at all and would fail his tests. And the teacher decided to send him to preschool for a week. And so him being in preschool, he's kind of having to deal with all the tiny kids, and he's realizing that he doesn't want to be in preschool anymore and he wants to try better in class. So yeah, that was my very first one. And then I had a bunch of others. There was one about a polar bear. There was one about a mermaid. I don't know. I had a lot of fun thinking them up.
Yeah. So fast tracking then to now, you've started Of Wood and Word. Can you share with us a little bit about what this is?
Yeah. So, and I'll talk a little about the origin story for that too, because
Yeah. Go
when
ahead.
when I was in high school, I had gotten into poetry, but then entering college. In college, I did write poetry too, but then I got to a point where, I was studying to be a teacher, and I was just going through some spiritual and personal stuff. I was growing
What
in
kind
my
of teacher were you looking to be?
special education. So I was looking
Okay.
to work in special education, and that was a beautiful thing. I loved being in that program, and now I don't teach. I just write, and I'm a mom.
Mhm.
But it was useful at the time, and I got to a point where I still had this desire to be a writer,
Mhm.
but whenever I just felt God telling me not yet. And I felt like every time I had an idea for a book, God kept telling me, like, you could publish that and it'd be good, but I have something better for you. So I reluctantly put the pen away. I probably overreacted, and I was just like, fine, I'm just not going to write anymore because I don't feel any fruits coming from this.
Yeah. I'm really curious, and you can feel free to bypass it if you wish, but how was it obvious to you that he had something to communicate? Now was not a good time. Like, how did that become obvious to you? Because I think some other authors really wonder that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think when I started hearing that from God, I was in a very intense discernment period. This is like a whole other talk I could give, but during that time, my husband and I were in a communication fast. We were dating at the time, and I was discerning religious life. And so that season was just really hard for me because not being able to talk to my at the time boyfriend, someone that I knew, I would kind of discern like it's either religious life or marrying this guy. Like it's not just marriage in general, it's like this guy. Anyway, that season was hard for me, but I had learned a lot of discernment tips from sisters, from priests, from friends. I felt like, in our darkest seasons, it's actually when God is closest to us. And so if we like open our ears, that's how we can hear him the most. And so I found that during that discernment period, when I was struggling, I felt very close to God, even though it was hard. And so I leaned on poetry a lot during that time. I wrote a lot of poetry, and that's why towards the end of that season, I looked at all the poetry I had, and I was like, I could turn this into a book. I could turn this into a poetry collection. But the times when I heard God telling me no, I was in a very like emotionally and spiritually intense moment. I remember being on a mission trip in Peru over the summer. This was after I had already gotten engaged to my husband. And I was sitting in a church, and I just kept thinking, I'm like, but God, I have all these poems and I love them and I want to publish them. And it was just a feeling, like I feel like a lot of, and this applies to writers because, it applies to anyone discerning anything, whether it's a book or an idea. I think anything that brings peace and joy, it needs to have both peace and joy. You can have joy about something, about an idea, but if there's no peace about pursuing it, if something inside just doesn't feel right, then it's not, either God's not calling you to it at all, or he's calling you to develop it more, to sit on it more and think about it. And so I felt that tug. I was like, these poems bring me joy. I think they could bring joy to others, but they're not bringing peace. Like I don't feel any peace about publishing these right now. So I listened after a few times because I think we also tend to be stubborn when we love our writing, and we're like, like I
Lord
love this.
save me. Yep.
Yeah, I'm still like that. There's projects where I'm like, maybe this could go somewhere, and God's like, sit down. But and obviously he gives us a choice, so we can still pursue something, and good will still come out of it. But I think God wants the best for us. He doesn't want us to just settle. So I put away the pen, and I was like, okay, if this isn't it, I'm gonna take a break. I'm gonna go through some life stuff. I got married. I got out of college, or I graduated from college, got married, moved around the country with my husband. Well, I say that we really only stayed on the East Coast, but we were moving around. And then when I got pregnant with my daughter, she's our first child, I I think what I can distinguish between, what I currently have of Wood and Word and previous things was that my current projects aren't rooted in just wanting to be published, in just wanting people to see my writing. I actually feel like there's a purpose to them, and when I was writing them, it wasn't for the purpose of like, I want these to be seen by the world. This was more of like, it originally started that. Let me backtrack a little. So I wrote a book called Fools for Heaven, and it's a children's book with poems that imaginatively retell the lives of different saints, kind of like a Shel Silverstein.
Oh, how cool. Is it available somewhere online?
Yes, so it's on my website of woodandword.com.
Cool. I'm going to drop a link in the show notes for people.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's what started pretty much my whole of Wood and Word brand.
Okay.
And I wrote that originally just for my daughter because I wanted her to have stories of the saints, and there were stories about certain saints that I couldn't find online that I knew about. So I was like, I'm just going to write them, and she'll be able to read them growing up. And then as I wrote them more and more, my husband was like, well, why don't you just publish this? And him saying that to me was kind of confirmation of like, okay, this feels like the direction God wants me in. This kind of, it brought me back to that church in Beru when he said like, I have something better for you. This felt like that thing. It felt like that moment that I finally was looking for. That it's like, okay, I'm actually going to get back into writing. I'm going to make this my career, because I also at that point had decided to give up teaching and just, I was in grad school for theology, and, it felt kind of like a good transition of like, okay, I'm going to have my first daughter, and now I can transition into a job that lets me be home and be with my daughter, and something that I love. I've always wanted to write. So it worked out beautifully. And so now I have Of Wood and Word. So it started with a children's book, and now I'm a company that just wants to produce poetry books, Catholic poetry books for people of all ages. So, now I'm kind of branching into books that are for older people, middle school and up. And I have a newsletter on substack.com called Writings in the Roots, where we, analyze poetry by Catholic writers or Christian writers. And I've, been interviewing people like you, and it's been so fun to dive into this world of writing. And I've been discovering so much about myself and my faith through this brand.
So tell us a little more then about what your primary project right now is, To Eden. Is that right? And is that it's a fictional poem about a saint and his adventures? Can you, where does that go?
Yeah, so kind of the way that I'm branching out into an older audience is through this project called To Eden. I'm trying to bring the epic poem back, which maybe not everyone wants me to bring it back, but I feel called to, and I'm excited about it. It's about St. Brendan and his journey to find the lost Garden of Eden. And when I first thought of this idea, I had the idea to publish it as a monthly paid newsletter so that other writers can kind of be involved. I would publish a chapter a month and then leave like a writing prompt at the end so people could respond and kind of interact and make it a collaborative project. And once I launched that, talking about discernment again, it's always a thing that's relevant in our lives. And once I published it, I was in a place where I started struggling with some health issues I wasn't expecting, and my husband was, we're on the road to recovery, thankfully, and it wasn't anything big. But I'm working with a practitioner now, and I feel much better physically, and it's beautiful. But I was struggling with that. My husband was getting ready for deployment, which in my head, I was like, once he's deployed, I'll have more time in the evenings to work on my project. But I found the opposite, because once he was gone, I still needed to clean the house, eat dinner. After putting the kids to bed, they've been going to bed later. And it was just, it felt like chaos.
Yeah.
And
by the way, how many kids do you have?
I have 2. So I have a 2-year-old, and then I have a 14-month-old.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And so I found that as I kept trying to push through the project, But I kept feeling that call from God again, saying like, I know you just launched this, but maybe you need to reimagine it. And I felt him saying like, I'm not asking you to quit the entire project, just reimagine it. Maybe it doesn't have to be a newsletter. Maybe we can just work on it to be a book. And I talked to my editor about it, because I had hired an editor to help me actually work on the chapters. And at first it felt like I was quitting, but then the more I talked to people about it, like my editor and my mom and just different people, I didn't know exactly why I was going through with this, but I was like, I know this is the direction I need to go. And now that I've done that, I'm realizing, wow, God really saved the project. Because I think if I had gone through with it as a newsletter, the amount of research that I've put now into the project wouldn't have happened, and it just wouldn't have been as quality writing as it should be. I stand by what I published in the newsletter. I think it's good, but again, I think God knows he could do something better with it. And that's proven by the 3 hours I spent in the coffee shop yesterday researching, Gaelic Irish royalty in 500 AD.
So what's your how are you just, so first of all, for a lot of our authors, this is a very, very real thing. There's a constant sense of discernment. Not everybody is able to just plot out something and then knuckle down for 1 month or 3 months and just get her done. Some people, it's a far more intense and creative process with actually plenty of stepping away to just let it percolate, and then you come back and it either is collaborative or creative. But it's plenty have their own writing paths, and what you just shared is can be a lot of discernment, especially when it means something very personal to you. Is there a timeline on this? Like, when are you anticipating releasing it, or are you just going to keep chasing it as long as it'll need to go?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've learned through this process with this project specifically is that, and I think sometimes it's good to have a timeline and to have deadlines, and because that keeps you accountable to a certain extent. But then I also think, especially for writers who are moms, or writers who have another aspect of their life to tend to that keeps them busy, it's hard to find consistent set times to sit down and be like, okay, from like 4 to 6 p.m. every day, I'm going to write. It's like, no, at 4 p.m., my kids are awake and like asking for a snack,
Yeah.
And so right now, I think I'm going with the flow. No, I'm not going with the flow. I'm going with the Holy Spirit. It's more than just going with the flow, like, oh, whenever I get to it, I'll get to it. It's more like I'm keeping my ear open to what the Holy Spirit is doing and where he's guiding me. And, if I find time in the evenings, there is some sort of a schedule. Like, there are some evenings that, my husband's okay with playing a video game while I sit down and write. And then there's some days that we dedicate to being together after the kids are in bed. It's a balance for sure. And there's sometimes during nap time where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to clean the kitchen right now. I'm going to sit down because I feel like right now I can really get something good done with this project.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what I mean by, following the promptings of the Holy Spirit. Like, sometimes I do find that I can sit down and write, and it's great progress. And then sometimes I need to tend to what's in front of me.
Right.
And it looks different every day, but I'm keeping my eyes open to, actually, I think I read something that Mother Teresa would wake up in the mornings and she would pray to God, asking that he have her do what she needs to do that day, and anything else doesn't matter. And so I think I've had that in the back of my mind of like, I wake up in the morning and I'm like, okay, God, like, just help me to do what I need to do today. If that's a lot of writing, great. If that's just being a mom and not touching my writing today, fine. If it's a nice balance where everyone's happy, great.
I think it is important for people to to learn to honor their own process. And that's something you do get through trying different writing styles and different writing routines. It does come from experience, but I think it's for some authors it is, how do you say, kind of whimsical, kind of quitting to just do whenever it feels like it, and then you never really make progress, but you're just waiting for inspiration to strike. And for some people, you might just need a writing habit just to start teaching it. But there are others, and it sounds like you're in this camp, where if you're practicing that kind of reverent attention, you don't need to just sit down and show up every single day, because you're cultivating something very deep inside. And then there are moments where it's just blindingly obvious, and so you just take that moment. So
yeah, exactly. And I've been binging like a writer's podcast, and one episode I listened to this morning was talking about, the topic was, should you write every day? And I loved the answer because it had its like one foot on each side of the prompt, and it basically said there are some times where you should write every day, but then there's also times where you need to take a step back, let inspiration come, like basically just live, like don't forget to live, because that's where the creativity is cultivated.
Yes, exactly.
And I find that a lot in my day-to-day life, especially being a mom and being a homemaker. There's so many, the conversations with my kids alone is like a gold mine for stories.
No
like
kidding.
they're so creative, and so it's a balance of, there are times where like I do want to, like, my husband has a long weekend right now, and so we actually have carved out times where I'm driving to a coffee shop and researching and writing for hours. And it's great. It feels awesome.
Nice.
But then there's other times, that I'm practicing creativity in other ways, because creativity goes beyond just writing. Creativity can be as simple as cooking a meal, or, seeing a flower as something else as I'm walking with my daughter.
Yeah.
So
filling yourself with experiences.
Yeah, exactly. And exercising that creativity allows me to feel more prepared sitting down to write, because that creativity, even if it's been a day or two or whatever since I've actually written, I'm still practicing that creativity and kind of daydreaming in my head about the story, and letting things simmer, so that when I sit down, I come with something prepared.
Yeah. Dear listeners, or watchers, if you're watching this on YouTube, and if you thought what she just shared was helpful, hit that like button. It's going to help more people to discover this interview. Quick question, and then we'll actually have a couple of rapid fire questions just for the heck of it. What was the name of the podcast that you're enjoying on writing?
Oh gosh. Okay. It's by, and I don't have my phone on me, so I don't remember.
Okay, no worries.
It's like, maybe I'll send it to you after so you can link it in the show notes.
Okay. All right, we'll put it in the show notes then.
Yeah.
Okay, rapid fire questions.
Go for it.
Pen or pencil?
Pencil. Yeah.
Yeah.
I erase a lot.
Coffee or tea?
Tea, all the way.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Morning person or night owl?
Naturally a morning person, more forced to be a night owl because I want
by
to
necessity.
Yeah.
Okay. Digital or print books?
Print for sure.
Okay. Favorite book to movie adaptation?
Ooh. Print to movie adaptation. Gosh, I have to really think.
That's not fair. Yeah, I know. Okay. Favorite literary character of all time?
I actually, first one that came to mind, which surprised me a little bit, is the death narrator in The Book Thief.
Okay.
Because if no one's familiar with that book, The Book Thief is about a little girl who's living in Germany during World War II, and the narrator of that book telling her story is death itself, and so death is kind of personified. He's given a unique voice, and I just always loved the style of, the narrator, his voice, and the fact that the narrator is deaf. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying this, but at the end of the book, the narrator and the main character have a conversation with each other, and it's just cool how it goes full circle.
Oh.
So
I watched the movie. I don't remember that closing conversation.
yeah,
How
and that's
interesting.
why
Yeah.
yeah, and that's why I don't think that book could ever be done justice in a movie, because everything I love about the book
Mm-hmm.
can only be found in the book and not
Wow.
portrayed in the movie.
Okay. Well, there you go, folks. There's a book recommendation, The Book Thief. Okay, I want to go back a little bit, actually, to when you were younger and, you're thinking about writing and so on. What was the dream for you then? I mean, now you're at a point where you're writing epic poetry. Like, yeah, why not? What was back then? Like, what were you dreaming about writing back then?
So I remember, well, in the 5th grade, I was just like, I want to be an author. And I don't think I thought much about it, and I was just writing short stories. The first time where I really remember fine-tuning that dream was when I was in the 8th grade. We read The Outsiders. And I think a lot of kids in 8th, or in middle school, or whenever they read The Outsiders, a lot of people can be inspired by that author. I think her name was S.E. Hinton. I might be wrong. But S.E. Hinton, when she wrote that book, she was 16, 18. All right, guys, don't fact check me. She was really young. She was a teenager when she wrote that book, and now it's like super famous, sold millions of copies.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading it and hearing about her story in the 8th grade and thinking, I want to do that. And I even remember thinking, like, I want to beat her. I want to be a published author at a younger age than her. Like,
Wow.
I'm competitive by nature, so I was like, I want to do better.
Nice.
And so the idea of writing a fiction book and
Mm-hmm.
publishing it that was always appealing to me. And
Right.
I remember
That's cool.
I remember in high school entering a local contest where you could enter to write any topic, right? Poetry, short story, longer fiction, whatever it was. And I entered to write a short story, and I remember submitting it and thinking, I have a really good shot. I think this is a really great story. And then getting an email saying, and you're rejected.
Oh.
And that was like the first wake up call of like, okay, if I like actually want to do this, I need to stop being cocky and thinking my work is just like automatically great, and actually work on, fine tuning the craft. And
Mm-hmm.
that was the first time that I also really thought like, okay, everything in its own time.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a big deal.
Yeah, we'll come back to later asking you about your dream now that it's been like a number of years. But let's talk about the dark side here. What were some of the? Well, was there a point where you began to doubt your abilities as a writer? What was that like for you?
I feel like, and maybe I don't know how many. I feel like a lot of writers can relate to this, but I feel like you almost like doubt yourself all the time.
Yeah, there you go. Uh-huh. Doubt
I think,
sandwich.
I think when something means so much to you,
Mm-hmm.
or let me not even talk from second person. Let me talk from my experience. When anything I write means a lot to me because it comes from my heart. And so there's an automatic, I think when anything comes from the heart, there's an automatic fear of rejection, or, something that's like, oh, maybe this isn't good enough. Maybe people aren't going to like it. And especially now I feel like the writing world, we're in this new phase where self-publishing has become bigger than ever. And traditional publishers are pickier than ever. So there's that. And I should mention that my children's book is self-published, and everything I do in my brand is self-publishing. Because I tried going the traditional publisher route with my children's book. And I think I submitted to maybe 5 to 7 different publishers, and they all essentially said, we like this idea, but it's just not for us right now. And so, and I had one publisher even tell me, we love this idea, but we think it's going to be too expensive for us. It's like too much of a financial risk, which I thought was interesting, and that's why
I'm curious. Yeah.
The competitive nature in me was automatically like, oh, so you think it's good, but
Hold
it's just too
my
much of a
beer.
risk? Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's launch a Kickstarter campaign and let's raise our goal. And we did
Wait, so
it.
you launched a Kickstarter campaign to get this thing off the ground? Okay, let's go there. Tell us that story.
Yeah. So when I was first submitting to traditional publishers, I already had self-publishing in the back of my mind. And I kind of told my husband, I was like, okay, I'm going to submit to these traditional publishers, but I'm not going to hold my breath. If they all say no, I'm going to go to self-publishing route. That's kind of I told God too, I was like, look, that's just going to be, I put it on God. I was like, look, this is how I'm going to work. Like, if you want me to go in the self-publishing route, just tell all the traditional publishers to say no.
Okay.
And obviously, like, I wasn't intentionally putting God in that box, but I think the way that my relationship with God works is that, like, I see what he's telling me, and I kind of, like, go in a direction of, like, okay, if this is what you want, then, like, tell me in this way. And he kind of, like, just, like, speaks in ways that I understand. So I got the no's from the publishers, and so I, like, prayed about it more to make sure that God was leading me in the direction of self-publishing, talked to my husband, and I decided, like, yeah, okay, I'm going to self-publish. But because, children's books are usually expensive with the illustrations, I knew that crowdfunding would make sense for my project. Because even though we had the money at the time to fund it, it's just, it just feels safer to crowdfund something. And then, crowdfunding in its sense is also a way of discernment, because if you're pushing to raise a goal and you don't hit it, then maybe the market just doesn't want your book, and maybe you need to shift gears and go in a different direction. So that was kind of my mentality. It was both a way to finance my book and use it as a discernment tool, a high risk discernment tool, because I was like, if people don't actually want this book, then I, no matter how hard I try, I probably won't hit the goal. And if I do hit the goal, that means there's enough people who want to see the book into existence. So I launched my campaign in, like, summer of 2021, and the goal was $10,000. It was enough to cover everything, and we hit it, and we surpassed it. We passed it by a few $1,000s.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it was such a gift. It was super humbling, because when you're planning something so high risk, there's always the idea that it could fail. And a lot of self-doubt went into there, specifically that summer, because right before I launched my campaign, someone else launched a Kickstarter campaign about a children's book about saints.
Okay.
And they were fully funded in 24 hours. And
wow.
It was wild.
How did that make you feel?
Scared.
Yeah.
In the beginning, at least, it made me scared. And I think this applies to the entire writing world too. I think we tend to be, I don't know, for me, when I'm writing something, I tend to be a little bit territorial. Like, I'm scared of competition, Like, if something, like, let's say I wrote, like a historical romance novel that's set in a Victorian era, and a competitive book in the same topic comes out at the same time as me, then I'm automatically like, whose is going to do better?
So how did you, when you saw that other Kickstarter and then them blowing through, it all in one day, what did it take for you to continue taking action and not just like, okay, I'm done, it's just not worth it or whatever?
Yeah. Well, I knew the first thing I wanted to do was eliminate the mindset that author was competition. Because that is such a toxic way to think. And even though it, like, feels pretty natural, and it's, like, instinctive to think that they're competition, because you want to sell your book, and there's a fear that if they sell theirs, there's less consumers for you.
Right.
But the convenient thing is that books are books. People are always looking for books.
I mean, that
And
Kickstarter just, I mean, you can looking back now, it's easier to see, but that Kickstarter just proved to you, oh, yes, there's an audience who wants this kind of content.
yes,
And one book
exactly.
is never enough.
Yeah. And so the first thing I did to kind of actively combat that mindset was that I DM'd that author on Instagram. And I was just like, hey, what you're doing is super cool. I'm planning to do something similar. Like my Kickstarter is launching in like about a month after yours ends. And I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about how you're currently running your campaign.
Wow, good for
And,
you.
thank you. And he was super, super kind. He responded. He was sending me audio notes with like in-depth explanations as to what he did.
Wow.
And I was able to jot down some notes and actually apply it to my campaign. He helped spread the word about a little bit on his Instagram page once mine launched. I talked
Nice.
about his book. We were kind of like, it was suddenly like not competition. We were actually colleagues. We were
That's
helping each other
awesome.
instead of viewing each other as competition. So
Mhm.
of course, like I didn't fully fund my book in the first 24 hours, but that's why I was given 30 days.
Yeah,
We don't
sure.
have to fully fund it in 24 hours.
So, how did you find? Did you have an audience before going into this, or did you have a pool of friends, or like, did you just launch it and then just see what happens, or how did you
Yeah,
kind of
so
ensure that you would get over the goal, or how'd you tackle that?
I had zero platform. I definitely I had my circle of friends and family, and I before the campaign launched, I pretty much created an email list of people who I knew were interested in supporting the book. So, everyone in my family, some college friends of mine that I had been friends with,
Hmm.
some friends that had been local to us where we were living at the time, just even
Hmm.
like people that I wouldn't talk to often, but they knew about what I was doing and they were like, oh, I want to support. Like I would add them to the list. So I probably had about 40 people on that email list that I would just update, how the setup of the Kickstarter was going and when I was planning to launch.
Hmm.
And then I reached out to some influencers because I know that's like a really big marketing strategy nowadays. And I happened to be friendly with a few influencers already.
Hmm.
So I sent them, I printed out some pages of my book and I sent them those pages with like little care packages and they talked about my book when it launched. So really, I think it was just word of mouth
Hmm.
and circulation on social media of people who were interested that got me, to get fully funded and to kind of like the launch of my book on Kickstarter was also the launch of my brand. So once the
Hmm.
Kickstarter was over, I was able to set up a website and get the books out to everyone, and that was pretty much the start of everything in my business venture
Hmm.
was from that Kickstarter.
Oh, that's exciting, and I hope that our listeners, uh, take heart from that.
Thank
Sometimes
you.
all it takes is like a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe or something. When you create that space of vulnerability, you create an opportunity for other people to move into it. Otherwise, sometimes things don't seem to move because we don't know how to ask. And I totally put my hand like way up because I am terrible at asking for help. Okay, so here's what we're going to
Me
do.
too.
We're going to uh, wrap this conversation here because the next two questions are going to be really, I'm really excited to be asking you these. But what we're going to do is we're going to make them available as a separate video only inside the Legend Fiction community. So if you're listening to this or if you're watching this, dear friends, you can hit the link in the description, head on over to the Legend Fiction community to catch the rest of our conversation. We're going to be talking about how the author strikes back and the Fellowship of the Quill. And that's about what they learned about
Ooh.
themselves through this process and their advice to someone starting out. So, what Stephanie has to say to people starting out or to herself. Um, Stephanie, where can people find you online? Let's leave that with them.
Yeah. So you can find me on my website of woodenword.com. On Instagram, it's the same handle of Wood and Word. My Substack newsletter is called Writings in the Roots. You can find me directly on the Substack website or through my website. And one thing I forgot to mention where you can also find me is that I am a crowdfunding instructor for the Fiat Self-Publishing Academy. So
Awesome.
if anyone is interested in learning more about crowdfunding and want additional resources for self-publishing, all of my resources for crowdfunding are in that academy.
Now that's exciting because we're also LegendFiction is also an affiliate for the Fiat Academy, so
Awesome.
good friends
Well,
with
there
them
you go.
too. Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's actually I think I want to have you back to talk about crowdfunding. Maybe do something
We can
slightly
totally do
different
that.
than Fiat. Okay, friends, thanks for joining in and chatting with us today. I mean, we may not have a secret lair, but we do have a YouTube channel, so subscribe to LegendFiction and let's just create some epic stories. So if you're a LegendFiction member, don't go away. Follow the link in the description. Head on over. Stephanie, thanks again for joining us. Have an amazing rest of your day, and God bless you, everybody. Keep writing.